Now, let me introduce our this morning opening keynote speakers. So first of all, you couldn't have asked for a better lineup of keynote speakers. So we have Robert from IBM, we have Prith Banerjee from HP, and then we have a very unique individual, Tim Draper. Some of you know he is, in fact, his father was also in venture capital, and he has been one of the major venture capital individuals who have played a very unique role, not just for making money, but he is one of those guys who cares very deeply about the societal impact of the technology and the IT at large. So we will hear from Tim as well. So let me first introduce our first keynote speaker, who is Dr. Robert Morris. And many of you heard Robert last year in our Global Summit, and in fact, I got a special request from many of you, please invite Robert and make sure Robert is here. So I made sure that Robert commits to this date, and that's how we started the program planning for. Robert is the Vice President of Services Research at IBM. He also heads global labs for IBM. Before this role, he was the director of Almaden IBM Research Center here in San Jose, where, as you all know, the scientists and engineers do a lot of exciting work in the area of exploratory and applied research in computers, physical and behavioral science. Robert began his career with Bell Lab, where he was a very accomplished scientist. Robert was also a chairman of the Bay Area Science and Innovation Consortia called BASIC, here from 2002 to 2005. BASIC is an organization which heads a lot of Silicon Valley research institutes, very similar to some of the work we do here, and we also plan to connect with BASIC and SRIA as we go forward. Robert is an IEEE fellow and also advisory board member for several major universities and research institutes all around the world. Very recently, Fortune magazine called Robert a smartest scientist. So it is my huge honor and pleasure to welcome Robert, the smartest scientist. So please give a big round of applause to Robert.
Thank you very much for the introduction. This conference and the formation of SRI has really been remarkable, a completely brand new area. I think the first thing that we need to do is thank Chris and the entire team, the founders, the board members, for the fantastic job of putting this conference together, forming the organization, of course, and then putting this conference together, where I'm just very impressed with a number of world leaders, people that I've met in various places around the world, both individual researchers and people who actually make the decisions concerning investments in many countries here around the world. So congratulations and thank you to you all. So I'd just like to start off with a little video on something that is related to my talk.
Watson is a system developed here at IBM to compete in what they've called the Jeopardy Challenge, which is to put a machine, a computer system, onto the Jeopardy TV show to compete against humans.
If you think about what it takes to solve a Jeopardy clue, essentially what you're doing is you're getting a description of some entity, and it's described in natural language that's not very direct.
The three most important problems that make natural language understanding hard are ambiguity, ambiguity, ambiguity. Every word you say the word bat, I don't know if you're talking about a stick or, you know, an animal.
When you say kissing and liking and happy, what's that inside there, that combination of things that we understand as humans, but that the machine has no way of understanding?
You know, it's not just search, and it's not just parsing, and it's not just semantic interpretation. It's all of these things, and you have to do all of them well and quickly.
What the brain is doing is actually a lot like what computer hardware is doing.
If you were to look at what's going on in the brain, you think, gee, I mean, there's no understanding in here. There's just neurons firing and patterns of neurons firing, and you know, how's that understanding?
You don't realize that when you access a word like bat that you actually are thinking, is this a flying mammal, is it a stick? But it's happening mostly below our level of conscious perception.
Somehow it all composes into something that we experience as understanding. Maybe Watson has reached that point where you just say, instead of trying to describe it as, no, it associates this concept with this concept and that concept, and realize, eventually you just say, okay, it understands.
Okay, so with that introduction, what I'd like to do today is do a couple of things. Get you to think about services maybe in a broad way, and also get you out of your comfort zone about services. And one of the approaches to services that I'd like to get you to think about today is to realize that actually many of the most pressing problems in many of our industries, whether they be health, education, government, energy, transportation, whatever, are in fact heavily problems of information. They're problems of information, and that information needs to be handled, processed, and used in new ways and very exciting ways in order for us to be able to tackle those informational problems. That information is out there to an unprecedented extent, and it's also very unstructured, some structured, but a lot of it is very unstructured, very diverse information. For example, as shown in the chart, there's very structured vector space data with tuples of information that you can really process with in all the ways that have been taught in school, engineering schools for 100 years, right? But there's also now geographical information, there's social information, and of course there's textual information and natural language information of the type that we just saw illustrated in the video about Watson. By the way, for some of you of the global visitors, you may not know anything about Watson. What Watson was a question answering system which was tested against the most popular quiz and the hardest quiz show that operates in the United States, where very subtle questions full of many puns and trick questions are asked. They require tremendous general knowledge and require to be able to put that knowledge together in interesting ways in order to solve those problems. And several years ago, we started in IBM with some collaboration with some universities to build a system to try to say, could we do well in question answering like that? And in fact, in the end, in February, just a month ago, we played against the two strongest players ever in the history of that game, and actually were able to outscore them. I won't say defeat them, but we did outscore them. Yeah, and it was rather an interesting experiment. And in fact, the comments you saw on the video weren't from IBM. They were all from academics, various academics who research this particular field of question answering and natural language understanding. And in fact, a couple of those academics we also collaborated with, and they provided us with some elements of the solution that we ended up using. So, hard problems solved by information, and we need to be able to process that information in a completely new way, and it's getting so complex and so hard that we're going to have to deliver it as a service. So that summarizes my talk today, and let me tell you a little more about this subject. So first of all, Watson. You might be interested, particularly if you haven't heard much about it, you might be interested how it works. And it actually works in a way that is not too dissimilar to the way humans answer questions. It first of all comes up with a number of possible answers. It generates, and then it tests. It generates, in fact, hundreds of possible answers to those complex questions by forming hypotheses around what the subject matter may be, what the pun may be, what the trick may be in the question, etc., and what the domain may be in the question. And then it goes to a much larger set of literature, not the entire web, but thousands of documents and books that we loaded into the system. The system was isolated from the web during this experiment. And then it scores those hypotheses until it comes up with a set of answers and the confidence level associated with each answer. Okay, and then since there are points involved, in fact dollars involved in the game, and it's a game where you lose money if you're wrong, okay, it's necessary to then have a confidence, a probability of being correctness, and then you use a decision process to decide how to answer. But it's more than that. It's also a learning system. On the top right of the chart, you see a learning model which over time, as it succeeds and doesn't succeed, as it learns about human languages and the tricks that people ask and the kinds of questions and the kinds of information that is asked, it learns. And that is also an essential aspect of these services. And by the way, why as services? Why can't individuals and individual companies do this themselves? Why might they need help? Because they'll need the collective learning against many, many institutions, against many, many examples. And that's why it'll be so valuable as a service. Now, another point I want to get you to think about is the rate of change. And in question answer, we took the most advanced, we scooped up the most advanced question answering technology that we could. It's the brown line at the bottom. And we used it to play the game of Jeopardy on past questions, right? And what you see there is an analysis of how we did. Precision versus percentage answered, right? Of course, if you answer more, right, you'll have, since it's a probability, you'll get more right, but over time your precision will go down, right? And you can see in the process since late 2007 how we were able to advance the accuracy by moving that curve up into a point which begins to cross a lot of those red and blue dots. What are those red and blue dots? The red dots are the games played by Ken Jennings, who is the most powerful and most successful player ever in the game of Jeopardy. And you can see that, in fact, the performance of the machine began to be comparable with him. And so we were very excited. We didn't know if we'd win or not when we did this, right? But we were very excited, and in fact, it did outscore Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter. Brad Rutter was the other player, and Brad Rutter, by the way, is the person who has won the most money on Jeopardy. He's probably the best gambler, right? So, what is happening with all this data? A couple of things are happening. How did we get here, and why did it change so fast in the last 5 to 10 years? Well, in IBM, we run a process every year where we look at technology, we look at what's happening, and one of the things that we like to do particularly is look at the amount of data, where information is coming from in the world. Well, we look at that, and it used to be, most of the information came from people typing, and it was replicated, okay? And then, over time, more and more of that data began to come from sensors. And today, that data is coming in a massive way, many, many orders of magnitude more than all the humans on the planet could produce if they just typed flat out, right? Those sensors, which are, of course, video, sensing, RFID sensing, sensors of the environment, surveillance, all of those things producing massive amounts of data. And not only that, some of that data is textual, it's being written down, but much of it is unstructured. If you think about video information, it's largely unstructured. You don't know a priori that that's a man walking down the street. Okay? You have to create models. So the instrumentation has been fantastic, the change in the instrumentation, but also the connection, of course, through the internet. Okay? And finally, the intelligence, the ability to provide massive computational power, and also the ability to apply that in very intelligent ways, like the example that I just showed you on the video. And we'll come back to another point. It's very interesting, and we always do this, look at the trends of those technologies. And something that has been true for 30 or 40 years, and it's not changing, there's always storage always outperforms processing in its gains, and processing always outperforms communication. And that is causing issues, problems, and opportunities. Okay, so what do you do with data, and how do you form these new smart services that I'm talking about? Well, it's actually not too much different than we've always solved hard problems and created new services, right? We've got to try to come up with a very clear definition of a problem. We've gathered data, we've analyzed the data, we decide, and then we act. And by the way, deciding and analyzing and writing papers without acting is not very useful. People need to act, whether it's to deal with an economic condition, a competitive condition, a disaster, whatever it is, people need to analyze this data and they act, and they need to do it typically in a fast and accurate way. And as we said, that data is structured, unstructured, it's massive, it requires specialized, fantastic skills, and therefore it's going to be delivered as a service, right? So, since we're all here at a services conference, let's just talk a little bit, step back and talk about these things that are services. Now, I realize here that I'm preaching to the choir. You're all here at services conference because you're either involved in services or you have a degree of interest. You're interested enough to come to this conference. And so let me just tell you things that you may already know, you may not have seen the data in this format. Okay, the whole world is moving towards services economy, or services as the way of delivering value. And one way we can see that is in the composition of our time. This is analysis that was first done at the Almaden lab. And what it shows there is for a variety of countries, China, India, US, the AG&S is agriculture, goods and services. It shows how agriculture and goods have become smaller parts of our economy and services have become predominant parts of our economy in industrialized countries, and they're getting that way even in countries that aren't fully industrialized yet. This is a massive change, and it's worth pausing for a minute and asking the question, how did we get here? Why is everything moving to services? Well, it's one of the reasons has been because our friends in agriculture and manufacturing have done such a fantastic job. Moore's Law being the example that we're most familiar with. How do you beat 40% improvement every year? And by the way, the agriculture guys have done pretty well as well if you look at their productivity. Maybe services hasn't done quite so well. There's other reasons. Other reasons are the growing specialization of our lives and therefore the growing complexity. Just think about it. It's almost tax time in the United States. Just think about the complexity of filling out your tax return. Think about if you get sick, the number of specialists that you have to see. Think about the education of your children. You have to pay someone 20 years to educate them. Everything is so specialized, and we're all so specialized now that we need to buy these complex services from others. Now, you're saying, tell me something I don't know. I know all this, I've been to services conferences before, right? Well, there's some surprises in here. This is a graph of the number of people involved. But there are many things that aren't as well understood. For example, the United States, it's constantly recognized as becoming a minor manufacturer, has great decline in manufacturing. But what many people may not realize is the United States, for example, still has a major trade surplus in services. It has a huge surplus in engineering, IP, entertainment services, medical, financial, advertising, etc. So what you read about goods and goods flows across borders and what receives most of the attention in trade is not always true. And something else, we harked back to the point that things are moving to services because of complexity. But that's not necessarily good. Maybe it's because we haven't done a good job in services, in productivity. Maybe we haven't done a good job in quality. And finally, maybe all services aren't that good. In fact, there are countries, some countries that I interact with people, with their economists, and they say, yeah, our countries are developing countries 40, 50% services, but when you look under the covers, it's hotel room, people cleaning hotel rooms. And that isn't necessarily knowledge-based, and it's not necessarily good for the future of that company. So I hope now I've got you out of your comfort zone a little on services. And let me now be even more explicit. This is data from the Institute of Business Value, which talks about the waste in services. Okay? This talks about, on the horizontal axis, system inefficiency as a percent of the economic value. Look at that. Healthcare, 40, 50% waste. We all know this. Every study, every honest practitioner or clinician will tell you that the error rate is huge in healthcare. The overheads are wasteful, okay? And a lot of treatments are given which are either unnecessary or do not help. The recent news around a whole variety of screenings, for example, for various diseases. Those screenings, in many cases, they cause interventions, they cause pain and suffering, they cost a lot of money, and they do not increase survival by 1 day. They may even decrease survival as a result of the screening. I'm not telling you don't get some screenings. I'm not a doctor. Go and get your screenings, whatever your doctor says. But be aware that there are huge flaws in the business model in healthcare. 40, 50% waste. And in fact, on the horizontal axis, what economists, we interviewed 480 economists for this, what they say is easily savable without major transformation. from 20 to 30, 40%. And in fact, much greater savings exist if we're willing to make radical changes in those industries. So again, before we get more comfortable, it's not just us services guys in our sector that may not be doing very well. We are affecting the world. And I won't go through all of this chart, but I'll just urge you, if you haven't read about Baumol's disease, to read about it. It's a very simple effect. If you have a two-sector economy, goods and services, and the goods are constantly undergoing productivity improvement, for example, through Moore's law, it's a great example, right? And the services are not, they're not increasing their productivity, then what happens? Because the answer is, as you learned in economics, it's a function of demand, right? If you don't have to have those things, you can do without them. In fact, forget about all those tax returns, all that complexity of our lives, getting our children educated. We can all go back and live in caves, and we won't need services anymore. We'll just need some goods, we'll need some food, and some shelter, and some transportation, some clothes. I don't think that's going to happen. Okay, those services have become mandatory and compulsory to us now. Okay, and so what happens? Services continues to take more and more of the wallet share, and it ends up in the extreme case of taking over the economy. Is that bad, all you service scientists? Yes, it is bad, because we just said it's not increasing in productivity. But therefore, the world economy is not improving or increasing in productivity. And the world economy gets tanked by us guys who didn't do a good enough job in services. So let me now ask you another question. This is one you might have heard, some people might have heard me ask this before. Why did Britain lead the Industrial Revolution? Now, by the way, I'm not boasting about Britain. I'm not British, I'm Australian. The British sent us to Australia as convicts, so we have no great fondness necessarily for Britain. But Britain did lead the Industrial Revolution. Even though literacy was better in France, far better in France, and technology and science was far better in Germany. But in the 1700s, suddenly Britain had this industrial revolution that pushed them onto the stage. How did it happen? Well, this actually has been one of the biggest and most pursued and most researched questions in economics for the last 50 years. And recently, a lot of very good work has come out on this. All, by the way, information-based, all data-based, and all full of graphs and curves. And the most appealing theory about this is very, very simple. Turns out, if you looked all around the world, including China and India, Britain had the cheapest energy in the world because they had coal. And they were getting coal out of the ground for various reasons related to the British Navy, etc., right? They had very cheap energy. But because of the success of the British Navy and the success of some colonialism, they also had very high labor costs, small country. High labor costs, very cheap energy. All they had to do was invent an engine to convert from energy to labor. That was the steam engine, and that caused a revolution. Okay? And you can read about that in Robert C. Allen's book called About Industrial Revolutions. It's cited there at the bottom. So what do we do about this, fixing these services? Well, we aren't going to substitute energy for labor. Energy is still important, by the way. Energy is still a problem. What we're going to do is we're going to substitute intellectual assets, software, typically created in the language of software, okay, for labor. And we're going to do a higher productivity job, and we're going to do a higher quality job, right? And when we make that substitution, the world will change, and we will no longer be the bad guys in the economy, okay? So we're amongst friends here. Let's commit to do that. And let me prove that to you. This is real data. These green diamonds on the left, they represent asset-based companies. Okay, these are all companies that are on the stock exchange in the United States, so we know, and we can read their reports. This is the operating income per head count of services companies that rely on technology assets, and the blue and the purplish color, those are traditional labor-based services companies. So they're much less profitable, and therefore, because they don't create profit, they can't invest in R&D and technology assets to, in fact, become asset-based companies, right? Or they're not in as good a position. And on the right, what that shows is data. These are actually from IBM projects where, depending upon how much of a technology asset there was in the services, what was the profitability. of that service. And you can see there's a clear trend up and to the right, which demonstrates that if you have a service that is based on a technology or differentiated by a technology, you're in a great position to generate profits which allow you to both give them to your shareholders, give your employees good jobs, but also to invest in R&D to further create those assets. So this is a major factor, and that's why the SRII is structured as having these IT horizontals amongst these vertical industries. So let's talk about services. And today I'm going to particularly not talk about IT services. I spend the majority of my time on IT services, but I want to talk about non-IT services. Why? Because it gives us insight into what we can enable and also allows us to address some of those very wasteful services, the ones that you remember on that curve: health, education, government, but also transportation, energy, buildings, etc. So what are these new services, and how will we create them? Well, we'll create them through, obviously, through new techniques like cloud. And in fact, cloud infrastructure is powerful because it allows us, as you all know from the economics of cloud, to actually amortize certain costs and improve the utilization of physical resources. But that's just the physical part of clouds. That's just the physical statistical multiplexing of cloud. And it's what most people are preoccupied with in clouds today. But that just scratches the surface of what's really valuable and really important in cloud. What's really valuable and what's really important is the ability to manage data. And not just manage data, but share data, and therefore get increasing returns from that data. And then not just have that data and not just be wise on data, but to actually be able to convert that data into decisions or actionable recommendations. And if we can do that, we can make transformations around how that data is used to solve important human problems. So I'm going to pick one industry, which I think is very illustrative. It was the most wasteful one on the chart that we saw before, healthcare. Okay? And I want to talk a little bit about how that becomes a lesson or a prototype for us in the transformation of services. So, healthcare is changing, and I'll show you why. But what I want you to look out for here is the destruction of the assumption of a trade-off. Okay, people usually assume, and in fact it's played a central part in the debate in the United States about healthcare transformation, that if you improve or if you make healthcare more efficient, and you lower costs, that you will necessarily decrease the quality of services. And one of the things I'd like to demonstrate to you is that you can actually, we're so far off the Pareto curve or the trade-off curve that in many of these services it's very meaningful, very possible, and in fact very practical to simultaneously decrease costs and improve quality. And in fact, the screenings that I talked to you about before, exactly in this case, if you don't use the information in an incorrect way from the screening, you both decrease the cost and you improve the health outcome. Okay, or at least leave it the same. So you don't necessarily have trade-offs, and this will be a major lesson from what we talk about today. Simultaneously provide better outcomes and lower costs. So let's look at what's the background, what's changing in healthcare. Well, you all know the individual is changing. I mean, Kaiser, for example, in California is a great institution. It's beginning to put a lot of its information on mobile devices. Okay, people are becoming connected. People are becoming individually empowered. Huge amount of information on the internet. But it's also changing from a fundamental data creation. Many of us will actually have our genome personally sequenced, or many of us have already had parts of our genome personally sequenced. So we'll be able to get data which has extremely high leverage to actually find the right treatment and not do the wasteful or incorrect treatment. Value. The game is changing in value. People are looking for outcomes. They're looking to pay for outcomes, not looking to pay for operations or services. And finally, collaboration. IT is allowing us to actually have a much better collaboration between the patient and the clinician, as well as different members of the clinical team. So, what can you do with technology? Well, you'll be surprised, not be surprised to learn that with the Watson technology, after we completed the match, we didn't actually put it on a shelf and forget about it. We actually started applying it, and actually have been applying it for some time, to certain hard industry problems. The one which we're doing the most work in fact, is healthcare. And this is real data from using Dr. Watson to help get a correct diagnosis around a set of symptoms, history, family history, symptoms, history, medications, lab results, etc., which has determined that for this particular patient, the predominant comorbidities are urinary tract infection and diabetes. Okay, that's what it points to, right? So technology is great for doing the following. It's great for actually improving diagnosis. It's great for looking at masses of data at the point of care which nobody could otherwise cope with. And it's great for having a confidence. Okay, we don't want our doctors to tell us things that they're not confident about. We'd like to understand the confidence. So technology can do a lot. And by the way, since particularly for specialists now, it's almost impossible to keep up with the literature. There are hundreds of papers coming out every day on any one disease. There's no way. What the system can also do is mine through all of that data and actually not tell the doctor what to do, but tell them, here are some care considerations. Do you know that it's just been found that this particular treatment that you're about to recommend, through massive amount of information and clinical trials, no longer helps? A little warning before the clinician goes and prescribes that treatment. Okay? So, care considerations, dealing with an overload of data, and providing a confidence level, which I think all of us as patients would like to know. But there's more than technology. So let me bring you to another illustrative point. And this is an example of a diagnostic and management system that we've put in place using a cloud called the Collaborative Care Cloud. And it's actually implemented with a provider group in Southern California at this time. It's being used to treat patients. This trial is around diabetes. And what it does is the following. It takes all of that data and it uses a cohort analysis technique of finding like patients, looking how they've progressed and across many thousands of patients and looking how if they're treated in a certain way, they're likely to progress or not progress. So therefore it can rationalize the particular treatment to prevent progression of diabetes. Okay, well, interestingly, when doing that, the data came out that there are some doctors who are very, very skilled and have almost 100% success rate at preventing progression of diabetes in certain types of patients, and there are some that are not. And some that are not may be actually effective in other classes of the disease. Maybe they'd been able to spend more of their time doing the reading since nobody can read all the literature, right? And so that then allows the possibility of not just using technology the way I described it on the previous chart, but actually using it to do a fundamental process change, which is, let's put a step in, which is the allocation of the patient to the physician group that can best help them, that happens to have that skill to help their particular condition. Okay, that's a process change. And more than that, for people that have chronic diseases, since that treatment has to be paid for, maybe the treatment and the financial model can change as well. And we can get to a point where we pay for outcomes, which is, the outcome is preventing progression, versus just paying for service. So I want you to think about that. Technology allows automation and improvement in quality in doing what you're already doing cheaper and better. But if you really want to do it very differently and far more successfully, don't just optimize the cow path. Don't just optimize what you're doing today. Transform the process. That's far more powerful than optimizing what you're already doing. So process transformation always trumps a pure technology automation, and there's something that trumps a process transformation. And that something is a change in the business model. So if you can change the business model in healthcare to pay for outcome instead of pay for service, I guarantee you a lot of that waste will automatically go away because of human incentives. So think about it. Technology, but even more important is a process change, and even more important than that is a business model change which creates the right incentives, creates the right behaviors, and prevents people from being incentivized to waste or provide low quality services. So that's healthcare. Having done this transformation that we've talked about, productivity, improved quality, doing things differently so that we can transform not just processes but create new and better processes and outcomes, what does that now allow us to do? One of the things it allows us to do is actually now recenter and decide what those changes ought to be. And the way of changing what those outcomes should be is actually by doing nothing less than reconnecting with the customer, or since the services by definition is a provider and a client or a customer, changing the understanding of that client. Okay, that is the only way you get to the higher level functions. So how do you understand that better? If you're creating a service and you're in the service business, how do you better understand the target and the behavior of your client? Well, again, it's an information-based service. And the way you do it is by, first of all, mining the masses of data that we now have at our disposal, including things like news articles and Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and all of those things, right? Mining that to actually find out what people want, what people think. And what you're doing with this is you're creating an understanding of the collective of the target of your services, right? This is a very fundamental principle in service marketing. You have to understand that client. But we're now enabled with information services to actually be able to do that. We can do that on the top left quadrant, but we can also use typically categorical or quantitative data to actually do very deep dives and look for weak signals in, for example, sales figures. If people are buying your product or buying less of your product, maybe that's because or related to what they're saying about you on the web. So there are weaker signals in there, but extremely valuable ones because they're often measured in units of dollars. So very interesting. And on the bottom there, it's not enough to be able to give somebody a hint about what's being said or what's being bought. The whole process of dealing with this collective, we need to be able to interact and negotiate with that information in order to find out what's actually going on. And that's where the drill down or the discovery occurs. So what I've just described to you is understanding the target of your services by understanding the bulk effect or the macro effect. What about the micro effect? What about the individual? And massive changes and improvements can be made by understanding that little individual. Here's an example. If you were to actually understand Amy Byrne and realize that she has certain demographics, she has certain behaviors which are exemplified by what she writes about on Facebook, certain phone calls that she makes, etc. And this is all, of course, compliant with privacy laws, which vary from country to country, but compliant with privacy laws. If you were able to mine this information in an appropriate way, then think about how powerful that could be to a telephone company that wants to offer a promotion to her to make it cheaper and better for her to influence the many people that we know she influences. Similarly, how can we really begin to put the, have you been into these retail stores where they have hundreds of thousands of items of clothing and no one seems to be buying them? How can you have less inventory that people actually want, right? And doesn't have to be seconded or disposed of, right? Massive waste in the retail industry. And finally, how do you actually figure out what to do with Amy's contributions as a potential employee, as the contractual model, as the model of labor changes, and many people move more and more into a model where they take their skills and apply them not just to a single employer, but to many employers. So this is very exciting, and we see huge changes going on in the way services and products as well are marketed, and the way individuals contribute their capability either as a consumer or a contributor into this wonderful ecosystem that we have. So we've been saying all along, this is all about data. But you knew that. You knew it was all about data. In fact, I've spent a good part of my career working in storage and data management and database. And has anything changed? Well, I want you to think back to the story we told before about where the data is coming from. All the human-generated on a keyboard data and even point-of-sale data, right, is all tiny in comparison to the data that's now being generated by sensors, right? In fact, that data is so much so that I said before that storage capability and improvement always outruns processing, which always outruns communications. Well, there's one thing that outruns storage. What is it? Sensor technology. It's able to produce so much data that now that we can't even store it. And by the way, a lot of that data even has no right or no use to be stored. So how do you change the model of use of that data from understanding all the data that's out there to be mined through slowly, carefully, to one where all this data is coming at you through sensors and you need to make decisions now. And the reason you need to make decisions now is because you either have to respond to a disaster scenario, or you need to respond to a fast-moving market, or you need to respond to a financial market effect, or you need to respond to an environmental situation, right? So data is changing. The whole world of data is beginning to change from data at rest to data in flight. And this is generally and commonly referred to as streaming technology. And what it requires you to do, which is very interesting, is to actually decide on the fly all that data that's coming at you, what's significant and what's not. And the fact is you can't just do it all based on the data that's there now. You actually have to look at trends. So you actually have to look back at what the data was before. Is the rainfall increasing? Right? Are sales increasing or decreasing? So you have to use a little bit of history. But you also need to look what's on the bottom, which is all the learning. Remember in the Watson example, all that learning over running thousands and thousands of games and learning what kinds of domains are actually used and what kinds of human language tricks occur. You need to use all of that accumulated history intelligently against current and near-current data. And that's what streaming data allows you to do. And I'll give you an example of this. This is a beautiful example that we've worked with the Children's Hospital in Toronto on. Neonatal care, the care of prematurely born infants. And it turns out that for prematurely born infants, the single factor which causes them most often not to thrive, and in fact not to live in some cases, is infection. Okay? They obtain infections which their small bodies and immune systems are not able to deal with. So how do you take all the data and trend that data and also compare that with all the histories of what you've observed as happening before in neonatal intensive care situations, and in fact get an early warning even before the signal is clear in the data that an infection might be brewing in a premature infant? Well, you do it using this streaming technology. And this turns out to be ideally suited. It's massive amounts of sensing data, and it's also comparing it against a significant amount of cohort and previous experience data for models that aren't actually perfected yet. Many other uses of this, obviously in public safety and security, obviously in the financial markets, obviously in events like, in situations like radio astronomy, where actually there are situations where I think of the order of petabytes of data can be generated. Petabytes per second, how do you like that, right? So, you know, you obviously need to do a lot of streaming. You need to find the most important events because you can't afford to store all that, right? So, this was already very personal. It's about us and our role as services strategists, technologists, business executives in dealing with these problems. But let me close with some examples which I think illustrate some further points. And I'm going to talk about cities and environments, okay? And to me, these are very interesting because we've recently learned a lot of lessons about the integration and management of services. By the way, what is a city? A city is a place to live, but what determines to a very great extent the quality of life in that city is in fact the services. The education that your kids can get or that you can get yourself, the water, energy, transportation services, the entertainment services that are available in that city, perhaps the crime management services. There are factors. You think about it, a city is a collection of services, and those services are not independent. We found this out in a very interesting way. Actually, you hear a lot about services jobs being placed in low-cost countries, but a little city in Iowa called Dubuque, where we set up a center to do IT services in the United States, of which we're doing many of these, with 1,300 jobs. So we moved into a city of 60,000 people with 1,300 jobs. Doesn't sound like a lot, 1,300 on 60,000, but it did. We actually overloaded, we couldn't find housing. We overloaded the housing system, we overloaded the transportation system, and in fact, we even caused concern about the water and the electricity systems in those cities. So that turned out to be a great opportunity for us to say, okay, what can we do about water? Dubuque is a wonderful little Midwestern town, and the reason we picked it to do further experimentation is because it is small, and you can do things. And what we found out was, yes, we can work on water and electricity and housing and transportation, etc. But what's even more powerful is if we can do them together. So something I didn't know before, but turns out about half the cost of delivering water is in energy. It's the energy of pumping it up and down hills, and it's the energy of running the reclaiming plants, right, that treat the water at the end. So there's a huge relationship between energy and water. This will be my last example. I want to talk about traffic. Before, the guilty parties, the big guilty parties in inefficient, low-quality services are, you all know, health, education, and government. Actually, what about energy? You know, we have an energy crisis. Price of oil is over $100 a barrel. I often spend 20, 30 minutes sitting in traffic with my engine running. Huge waste. If we could just cut down on traffic jams, we could reduce energy expenditures around the world, you know, easily by 10 to 20%. Okay? So what do you do? Well, we've been having some fun in traffic. Okay? Top left, cold place, that's Stockholm. Okay? And we were engaged by Stockholm to put in a tolling system, or congestion pricing. So what that does is it raises the price for people to drive to keep people out of the city, okay? By raising the price and by putting automatic tolling, you know, this a gantry that you see there for tolling, we were able to cut down the traffic in the city, actually significantly decrease the pollution and significantly decrease the traffic congestion, and significantly reduce energy that's being spent on transportation. Sounds good, right? Actually, not so good. Probably there are people now who have to spend twice as long on public transportation getting to work because they couldn't afford the congestion pricing. Because these are the arguments. This is why it hasn't been accepted in Europe. They're on the trade-off curve. We've got to get people off the trade-off curve. Transportation is so inefficient, it's so wasteful, let's do something better. So enter Singapore, okay? So what we're doing in Singapore, having learned, and by the way, Stockholm's a success, okay? It's a success, but we can do it even better. You can get people to break the trade-off. You can get them to both, without charging anybody anything, you can get all of that, not all of that, but some of that traffic advantage. And the way you do it is by optimally using what you have, using the arterial roads in an optimal way. So by redirecting traffic so that hotspots in traffic are eliminated or reduced to the greatest extent possible. And you can do that with boards which say, go this way instead of that way, or you can do it on your mobile phone or through GPS systems or whatever. So think about it. Yes, you can manage the resource and you can move people on the trade-off curve and charge people more, or you can just get more. You can get, it's not something for nothing, but it almost is. You can get more for what you have by optimally using those resources. So that's another effect. A couple of lessons that I'd like you to take away from this. We're all involved in services. Services are very interesting, and there's a huge amount of opportunity to use IT to make them higher productivity and higher quality, okay? But think about the new services and think about the information base and how we can actually create even more powerful services where we learn together, we collaborate together. Just back to healthcare, if you can take another example. The clinical trial system has been called out by the Institute of Medicine as being completely broken. The clinical trial system is letting us down. And one reason is less than 1% of people ever are on a clinical trial for a disease, right? 99% of the other 99% of people all receive episodic care or practice-based care or regular checkups. What if we could take all that data, noisy as it is, and use that data to make decisions? That would be an information-based service, right? So think about information as the new currency of services, and think about how to improve them. Of course we can make them more productive. In fact, we're obligated. If we don't make them more productive, we are letting the economy of each of our countries and the world down. Also make them higher quality. I cannot stand some of the low-quality services that I have to deal with, right? And I'm afraid it's just about all of them have very questionable quality. Let's improve the quality, and that requires different techniques. We can learn a lot from manufacturing quality, but even though We were manufacturing for 300 years and we only had the revolution in manufacturing quality in the last 50 years. We've been predominantly services business in many countries now for 50 years, but we haven't had the quality revolution yet. So there it is for you to do that, create the quality revolution in services. And finally, not just cheaper and better, but different. How do you do it differently? How do you not just fix what's there, but how do you change the process to be fundamentally different and better? And how do you change the business model, right? You can maximize outcomes and lower costs simultaneously. There's a lot. I've given you some examples. It's very, very doable, particularly in wasteful services industries. And it's a huge opportunity for every one of us to do that. And it requires us to work together. The silo effect is very, very common, very dominant. It requires different organizations of governments to work together. It requires competing companies to work together through standards, through organizations like SRII. We need to get together. We need to interchange standards, benchmarks. We need to get together and present professional papers where we show our best practices, and so we can compete at a higher level of competing on actually doing the best technology, the best processes, the best business models. And I think if we do that, and if we take that as our approach in SRII, we're going to be highly successful. So I thank you all, and I wish you a great conference, and you have an incredibly important job to do, and from what I've seen of the papers, you're doing it, so thank you.